Here is your rewritten text in natural modern English, preserving the original meaning and removing all numbered citations. The extraordinary effort made by the pharaonic government of Egypt's 12th dynasty to occupy and control Nubia cannot be fully explained by the lure of natural resources alone. There was clearly a sense of unease shown by the strong focus on military matters. Many forts near the Second Cataract were strategically placed to respond to and block potential large-scale movements from the south. But was there truly something the Egyptians feared? And where did they believe such a threat might come from? The hymns dedicated to Thutmose III around 1850 BCE reflect both anxiety and relief after he secured the region around the Second Cataract. They praise him as a divine protector of the land, one who expands Egypt's borders and defeats foreign enemies effortlessly. He is described as slaying the Bow people without needing to fight, striking fear into the troglodytes in their own territory and destroying thousands of attackers with overwhelming force. His words alone were enough to drive enemies away, and he is portrayed as a tireless defender of Egypt's borders, allowing his people to rest safely under his protection. However, the events that followed indicate that the threat had not completely disappeared. It began to take shape in the form of a developing local power with native roots, roughly 130 miles south of the border established by Thutmose III at Semnakama lies the large archaeological site of Kerma, just past the Third Cataract of the Nile. Excavations first carried out by G.A. Reisner in the early 1900s, and later continued by French teams, have shown that from the time of the 12th dynasty until the early New Kingdom, Kerma served as the political and cultural center of a distinct African society. This community had distant cultural ties to the Sigroup peoples and stretched from the Second Cataract down to an area south of Nugdumbush in the Dongola region. Based on both its time frame and location, this Kerma culture appears to be what the Egyptians of the time called Kush, and what their ancestors in the Old Kingdom may have referred to as Yam or Irem. Strategic defense and agricultural potential played a major role in the selection of the site. Located on the east bank of the Nile, Kerma benefited from the natural protection of the nearby cataract and a wide stretch of arid land that acted as a buffer against Egyptian forces to the north. The expansive floodplain provided fertile ground, making the community largely self-sufficient in terms of food. After Egyptian power declined around 1750 BCE, Kerma rose to prominence and became what is considered the first true city in Sudanese history. Spanning more than 60 acres and housing around 2,000 people, the city was protected by mud brick walls 10 meters high, strengthened with stone and surrounded by a defensive ditch. The range in size and design of the mud brick houses and tombs points to a stratified society with clear distinctions in occupation, status, and wealth. At the heart of the city stood major public buildings including a temple, an audience hall, and a palace. The temple was a massive structure of brick, about 18 meters tall, with a staircase and possibly a shrine on top. The enormous circular audience hall and the palace's layout very different from Egyptian architectural styles suggest that the city followed local building traditions. Also deeply rooted in native culture was the significance of cattle and sheep. Livestock were kept within the city limits, and burials often included the sacrifice of sheep and the display of cattle skulls as offerings. At the height of its power, during the 17th and 16th centuries BCE, Kerma's political structure appears to have advanced beyond that of a simple paramount chiefdom. What the rulers of Kerma actually called themselves, or whether their government would meet modern definitions of a state, remains unknown and may not be all that important. Fortunately, we do have a few scattered references to the leader of the Kushite community clearly. The authority based in Kerma found in records from Egyptians who served him and even from a king of Egypt's 15th dynasty. These sources use the term Heka, a word commonly used for both tribal chiefs and state rulers. Apophis, a Hyksos king from the 15th dynasty, also used this title in a letter he reportedly sent to the ruler of Kush. Whether that letter is genuine, summarized, or entirely fictional It reflects how the Kushite leader was perceived at the time. He inherited power through monarchic succession, was referred to using diplomatic terms such as son in a style common in Middle Bronze Age politics, was expected to engage in correspondence possibly in Egyptian with other rulers who viewed themselves as kings, and was seen as a worthy partner for treaties and alliances. All of this supports the idea that Kush or Kerma was regarded as a monarchy rather than a chiefdom by its contemporaries. This interpretation is further supported by the burial practices found at Kerma. Its rulers were laid to rest in grand circular tombs or tumuli, measuring over 85 meters across and rising 3 to 4 meters high. The bodies were placed on beds made from valuable materials, often with headrests and sometimes covered by ox hides. These burials were accompanied by silver crowns, weapons, sandals, fans, food, and even the ritual sacrifice of hundreds of servants to serve the deceased in the afterlife. All of this points to a thriving native civilization that developed its own cultural forms with minimal influence from the outside world. Beyond the reach of pharaonic Egypt, Kerma stands as the earliest known indigenous high culture in Africa. Kerma's rise to power happened at a fortunate moment, just as Egypt was entering a period of political decline. After the death of Amenemhet IV around 1786 BCE, for reasons that remain unclear, the Egyptian monarchy began to weaken significantly. The ruling dynasty collapsed and was followed by a series of short-lived kings, who ruled for only about 25 years in total. These successors were not connected to the 12th dynasty or to each other. Egypt seemed to be sliding into chaos, a situation temporarily stabilized around 1760 BC when Sobkhotep II came to power. He ushered in a brief period of stability, marked by 9 short reigns, the longest lasting just 11 years. But Egypt's internal instability meant that distant provinces like Nubia, which had been annexed earlier, were left increasingly vulnerable. Sensing the shift, Kush appears to have seized its opportunity. Egyptian military presence in Nubia is still evident in the forts until about 1720 BCE, possibly even later, and Nubian leaders continued to appear at the Egyptian court. However, after that, records become scarce and history grows unclear. Fragmentary inscriptions hint at growing tension. A damaged stela from the reign of Sobkhotep IV refers to Wat, an unidentified enemy said to have been struck down in a great miracle. Many Egyptian forts in Lower Nubia show signs of having been burned, and it's highly likely that Kerma was behind these attacks. 2 inscriptions from Karnak dating to the 17th century even hint that Thebes itself faced threats from foreign invaders, though whether these attackers were Nubians or the Hyksos is unclear. What aligns with Kush's expansion beyond the Second Cataract and Egypt's retreat from the region is the discovery of numerous Egyptian artifacts, including statues in Kerma royal tombs. Since these objects appear in a secondary context, it's likely they were looted from Egyptian sites further north. As the Hyksos took over Lower Egypt in the mid-17th century BCE, driving out the last remnants of the Middle Kingdom government and forcing them to retreat south to Thebes, pressure from Kush on Upper Egyptian towns would have only increased. With this loss of territory, the remaining independent Egyptian rulers, now effectively under Hyksos dominance, had to watch as northeastern Africa was divided into 3 separate powers. A century earlier, Egypt had ruled them all. Now, Kerma controlled land as far north as near the First Cataract. It was completely independent, while the Hyksos, after some conflict further south, set their frontier at Kusay in the 14th district of Upper Egypt. These were prosperous and triumphant times for Kush. Its victories were not only marked by the display of captured spoils, but even former Egyptian overlords now came to offer their allegiance. With growing ambitions of imperial power, Kush began to adopt the symbols and practices of the only empire it had previously known, Egypt. Egyptian-style construction techniques started to appear in Kushite architecture. Temples were built with pylons at the entrance, and Egyptian symbols such as the solar disk and the Jed pillar were used as decorative elements. As demonstrated by the Kamose stela, Kush had control over the desert routes that allowed trade with the Hyksos to bypass. Thebes entirely? Numerous Hyksos artifacts, such as seal impressions, daggers, and distinctive jugglets from Tel Yehudia have been found at Nubian sites and in Kerma itself, underscoring the intensity and success of this trade relationship. In the early 16th century BCE, the weakened and discredited line of rulers from the 13th dynasty, who had remained isolated in Thebes for over 60 years, finally vanished. In their place, a new royal house, Dynasty 17, merged as the dominant power in the Theban region. Although the details of this transition are unclear, it is widely believed that the new ruling family was of Nubian origin. During the dramatic shifts in power throughout the 17th and 16th centuries BCE, not only had Egyptian soldiers entered into the service of the Kushite king, but Nubians had also moved north of the First Cataract to support the small Theban kingdom. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the appearance of a distinctive type of Nubian cemetery in both Nubia and Upper Egypt. These burials, found from the Third Cataract all the way north to Deir Rifa, were made in shallow circular or oval pits dubbed pangraves by early archaeologists. The objects buried with the dead, including pottery and weapons, are entirely Nubian in style. Inscriptions from the 17th dynasty confirm that the Medjay nomadic people from the eastern desert served as scouts and auxiliary troops in the war against the Hyksos. It is very likely that the individuals buried in these pangrave cemeteries were Medjay mercenaries. If so, this points to a shared interest between the Egyptians and the Medjay, both of whom saw Kerma and Kush in the south as common enemies. The 17th dynasty launched a war of liberation to free the Nile Valley and the Delta from foreign rule, targeting both the Hyksos at Avaris and the Kushites at Kerma. The first military move appears to have been made by Kamose, the third king of the dynasty, in either his first or second year of reign, although an official royal account of the campaign has not been found. Brief references and non-royal inscriptions provide some clues. It seems that Kamose attacked Kush before turning his attention to the Hyksos in the Delta. A letter from Apophis, the Hyksos king, to the ruler of Kush, written during Kamose's third year, pleads for help, saying, "Do you see what Egypt has done to me? The ruler there, Kamose the Mighty, is pushing me off my land. I haven't done anything to him like what he's done to you." A soldier from Kamose's army remembered that during the king's third year, he spent every day beating his drum, signaling ongoing warfare. Another man, described as a brave warrior, was rewarded with 46 possessions, likely captives. He was allowed to keep. Though Kamose's campaign is said to have reached as far south as Miu, deep within Kushite territory, there is little evidence that Egypt secured the desert regions along the way. However, Bun, a key fortress, was taken and rebuilt by the end of Kamose's third year. With the Hyksos expelled, Egypt began its aggressive push southward. Amos, who succeeded Kamose, turned his attention to Nubia and launched a campaign against Kunhen the Fair to defeat the Nubian troglodytes as soon as he had secured the Delta and ended Hyksos rule. A Nubian counterattack, likely led by a commander representing Kerma, attempted to strike back along the Nile but was repelled near one of the cataracts. The enemy leader and his troops were captured roughly 12 years later, during the 7th and 8th years of Amenhotep I's reign. Likely when he reached adulthood, the Egyptians launched another expedition deep into Nubia, south of the Second Cataract. They confronted the forces of Kush in a victorious battle. The Egyptian king personally struck down the Kushite leader in the midst of his army. The Egyptian forces took captives without suffering losses, and fleeing enemies were quickly subdued. Survivors and their livestock were driven into the desert. Egypt now controlled the territory all the way back to the Second Cataract, extending about 80 miles south of the old frontier once established by Senwosret III. Amenhotep I even occupied Sai Island, once a stronghold of Kerma, located just 68 miles north of the Kushite capital. By the end of his reign, Kerma, though weakened, still stood, but not for long. Within a decade, Kerma suffered a devastating collapse. Thutmose I, who succeeded Amenhotep I, planned a major military campaign early in his reign. Several inscriptions provide details of this campaign. The old channel at the first cataract was dredged to allow passage, and late in his first year, Thutmose's army crossed into Nubia aboard a fleet of warships. After about a month, they reached the second cataract at Tanger. There, disaster nearly struck at the rapids of Dal, but a naval officer named Kamose, son of Abana, saved the fleet by guiding it safely through the treacherous waters known as the Place of Capsizing. He was promptly promoted to commander of the navy. Soon after, the Egyptian force reached Sai and began preparing for battle. The exact time and location where the king of Kush made his final stand remain unknown, though it likely occurred north of Kerma, beyond the official language of the Thutmose stela. Our best account of the battle comes from Kamose, the marine commander. According to him, Thutmose I personally led the charge, possibly from his flagship, and struck down the Kushite king with an arrow to the neck in the first moments of the clash. The result was a total rout. Although two of the Kushite king's sons escaped and continued the fight later, the Kerma regime was finished. The city was destroyed, and its people were taken captive. This decisive victory, later remembered as the Day of the Slaughter of the Perfect God, marks the beginning of Egypt's empire in Africa. To secure the southern frontier at a strategically favorable location, Thutmose I and his army continued their march beyond Dongola, reaching Hagar el-Merwa, just past the fourth cataract, 2 months later. This was a key spot where the overland route from Lower Nubia reconnects with the Nile, making it an ideal location for establishing Egypt's new southern boundary. At Hagar el-Merwa, a rock carving was created showing almonry facing the Horus name of the king. Beneath it, an inscription laid down a formal curse on any Kushite who might dare to cross this new frontier. Roughly 6 weeks after reaching the southern limit, the Egyptian army had returned north to the ruins of Kerma. There, orders were given to construct a fort and to erect a triumphal stela at Thutmose, about 7 miles north of the former Kushite capital. Although the stela was inscribed some years later, it commemorated a lasting victory. From that point forward, the kingdom of Kush, once ruled from Kerma, no longer existed. Egyptian control now extended unchallenged throughout the south as far as Hagar el-Merwa. Although the reign of Thutmose I is often seen as a turning point in the history of Sudan, his overwhelming victory did not lead to immediate acceptance of Egyptian rule by the native population. For over a century, Egypt faced resistance from scattered and increasingly weakened communities that saw no reason to give up their independence. Right after the fall of the Kerma kingdom, for instance, 2 surviving sons of the Kushite king who had died in battle against Thutmose joined forces with a local chief from northern Kush in an attempt to establish 3 separate regional states. This effort led to raids and harassment targeting Egyptian settlers at a Fort Thutmose I had established somewhere in Nubia. Egypt responded quickly and with force, subduing the Nubian communities along the Nile. However, the more distant Sudanese groups continued to resist from within their valleys. A decade later, the Egyptians returned, this time under a young queen known for her strength, courage, and legitimacy. The army advanced over the mountains with horses, launching a campaign in which the rebellious tribes were defeated in great numbers. The operation was so secure and efficient that Hatshepsut herself felt safe enough to walk among the troops and personally bind prisoners. Graffiti found around the Second Cataract, dating between years 12 and 18 of her reign, may indicate continued military action against the final pockets of resistance. This likely concluded in year 20, when her co-regent Thutmose III commissioned a rock inscription at Thutmose celebrating the defeat of the one who rose against him. By the middle of the 5th-10th century BC, less than 100 years after the fall of the Kerma kingdom, Egypt had firmly established a regime of control and stability across Nubia and Kush, reaching as far south as Dongola. All previously independent communities that once acted as middlemen in trade with deeper regions of Sudan had been dismantled. Even before Thutmose I's death, systems were already in place to move goods and people from Sudan to Egypt through taxation or forced service. Ineni, a high official under Thutmose I, describes in his tomb how he witnessed Kushites, captured in war, being delivered as a body of prisoners to the service of the god Amun after the defeat of Kush at Deir el-Bahari. The Nubian god Dedwin is portrayed as loyal to the pharaoh, leading Sudanese captives to the Egyptian queen. Similarly, Puemur, the deputy high priest of Amun under Hatshepsut, recalls seeing large quantities of incense, ivory, ebony, electrum, aromatic plants, and living captives all brought back from military victories. By the 4th decade of Thutmose III's reign, it had become expected protocol for Sudanese chiefs to appear at the Egyptian court, offering tributes just as they had in earlier times. Their offerings included gold, ivory, ebony, giraffes, monkeys, panthers, spices, incense, gems, electrum, and especially gold. While the amounts recorded in Thutmose III's royal annals may appear small, this was only because they represented a specific kind of tax, usually a labor tax recorded as official entries in the king's daybook. Other surviving sources, such as temple income records, show far greater quantities. One example documents over 36,000 deben of gold alloyed. Egyptian settlements began to appear as far south as Napata, where the local population received royal proclamations and were even treated to public displays and performances. Given how effectively Egypt had imposed this Pax Aegyptiaca, it's difficult to take seriously the repeated claims from later 18th and 19th dynasty kings that certain tribes had suddenly rebelled and threatened chaos if not immediately subdued. Often, such military campaigns seem more like orchestrated spectacles. A messenger would rush in with news of an uprising, the king would enter a shrine to seek divine favor. The fleet would set out in grand style, the crowds would cheer it. It was all part of the performance. Sometimes, the king would appear in full glory in Thebes, standing on a royal platform while his troops assembled in formation. Meanwhile, long lines of people would parade past, offering tributes from the south, the likes of which, it was claimed, had never been seen before. One such campaign in the 5th year of Amenhotep III's reign was immortalized in rock carvings at Aswan and later became the subject of legend. However, the inscriptions that record it are vague, full of exaggerated boasts, and fail to pinpoint where or how the event actually occurred. Many of the campaigns conducted during the later New Kingdom were likely thinly veiled missions to acquire loot and slaves. Thutmose III's expedition in his 50th year may have been little more than a formal inspection tour. Akhenaten launched a military action against a tribe at the junction of the Nile and Wadi Alaki, based on a vague report that the Kushites were taking control of vital supplies. The result was brutal. 80 Kushites were impaled as a warning, and 145 captives were taken as slaves, along with 361 head of cattle. In Horemheb's tomb, rows of subdued black Africans are described as part of the benevolences, the tribute or spoils brought from Sudan. A report that the doomed ones of the land of Irem are considering rebellion was enough to mobilize Seti I's troops. His forces pursued the tribes into the desert, seized their wells, and returned with over 400 slaves. By the time of Ramesses II, dramatic depictions of the pharaoh charging into groups of fleeing Nubians had become a standard. Artistic scene, grand and energetic, but lacking any reference to a specific time or place. *** Inscriptions from Bin allow us to trace a line of fortress commandants spanning 4 or 5 generations, beginning under the Kerma Kushite rule and continuing into the early 18th dynasty. These officials referred to themselves with the general title senior, meaning magistrate or administrator, though some added the more specific title commandant of Ban. In one case, a commandant took on the title king's son, a term that would soon gain wider significance. During the second intermediate period, this designation was often used for royal envoys who weren't of royal blood but held significant authority, often with military roles. During Kamose's southern campaign, a man named Teti was appointed as king's son, followed shortly by another named Jaidi, both of whom left inscriptions at Tashka. These individuals are mostly names to us now, but soon a more prominent appointment was made. A scribe of offerings to Amun named Amos So Tayet was tasked with overseeing the administration of Egypt's newly acquired Nubian territories. He held the title King's Son along with Superintendent of the Southern Countries, clearly identifying his area of responsibility. His son, Turo, who later succeeded him, began his career as a temple scribe, a priestly figure and overseer of Emin's cattle. He eventually became commandant of Bon. This combination of religious and administrative training was common. Many later officials also came from temple service, though a few were trained in the royal palace. From the late 14th century onward, military experience became an acceptable qualification for the role of King's Son of the Southern Countries. Under Amenhotep III, the office was further elevated with the additional title of King's Scribe. Although modern historians refer to this position as the viceroy of Kush, it always remained closely tied to the pharaoh. The office holders were typically low-ranking officials who owed their entire status and power to the king's favor. It would be wrong to assume that a complex southern administration emerged immediately following Thumose's campaigns. Establishing a functional government in Nubia and Kush was a gradual and improvised process, taking much of a century to develop. During the reigns of the first three kings of the dynasty, the king's son and superintendent of the southern lands held a title with little actual authority, as there was no fully defined territory yet under his control. Only after the final defeat of the Kerma kingdom under Thutmose I and II did the office begin to reach its full potential. Later in the new kingdom, the main duty of the viceroy became overseeing the annual delivery of tribute. However, in the earlier period, others handled this responsibility. One such official was Harmeni, formerly the mayor of Hierakonpolis, who served during the reign of Amenhotep I. At some point, he was placed in charge of Nubia and proudly recalled his years of service. He brought tribute to the pharaoh annually, performed his duties without error, and was trusted by the king. He lived to old age in Nubia, faithfully delivering what was due. This doesn't mean that Harmeni's service predates the creation of the viceroy's office. In the early years, roles and responsibilities were loosely defined and likely overlapped. Significantly, with the reign of Amenhotep III, the office of the Viceroy of Kush reached the height of its development. The viceroy established his headquarters at Aniba and oversaw a vast region stretching from Hierakonpolis in the north to Karoi in the south, covering more than 1,000 miles. His primary responsibilities included overseeing this extensive territory, collecting the annual taxes, and managing gold production. A support network of scribes and household staff developed around the viceroy's residence in Aniba at Kuban, the center of gold production. Additional officials such as supervisors and scribes were stationed. In the tomb of the viceroy, one scene shows people of all ages, both Egyptians and Nubians, bringing gold rings and dust to two officials, the chief of the stable Hate and Hornifer, the scribe of the gold count. The structure of the southern administration mirrored that of Egypt itself. Just as Egypt had two viziers for Upper and Lower Egypt, the southern territories were administered by two deputies, one for Nubia and another for Kusha. Treasury, designated as the treasury of the lord of the two lands in the land of Nubia, was located at Aniba, where a treasurer managed the compilation of tax lists and the coordination of shipments. The administrative system also included departments related to agriculture and livestock, as reflected in titles such as Overseer of the Double Granary, Scribe of the Granary, Overseer of Cattle, and the ever-present bailiffs or local administrators, ***. By the time of the joint reign of Thutmose III and Hatshepsut, Egypt had established a permanent military presence in the Sudan. To support this, Thutmose III constructed a permanent frontier fortress at Napata, located nearly 1,000 miles south of Aswan. In a stela he erected at the site, he mentions receiving lumber from Kush planks of M3 cubic meters wood and limitless quantities of furniture made from southern acacia harvested in great numbers by his troops stationed there. Hatshepsut is the first ruler to refer to a standing army in Kush, a term that would later become standard for Egyptian occupation forces. South of the First Cataract, modeled after similar military structures in Asia and mainland Egypt, the garrison was organized with a commanding officer, battalion leaders, quartermasters, and army scribes. garrison duty was never considered desirable, and service in the hot southern regions was especially unpopular. It was viewed as a form of punishment or exile. Soldiers were settled in small villages along the Nile and could be mobilized at any time. These troops were often grouped by village into quick response units. Initially, the garrison in Nubia was tasked with maintaining control over the Sudan, enforcing order, and launching punitive missions when necessary. However, by the end of the 19th dynasty, this military force had grown increasingly autonomous, becoming unruly and unpredictable. Incidents of unrest in places like Irem and Akita, along with the violence that required retaliation under Marinta, may point to deeper instability within Nubian society. It's unclear whether the Kushite garrison was directly involved in the civil strife that marred the end of Marinta's rule, but it was certainly implicated in the plot to assassinate Ramesses III. Later, members of the garrison were involved in tomb robberies. 70 years afterward, as will be discussed later, the garrison once again inserted itself into Egypt's political affairs, this time attempting to claim ultimate authority. It is evident from the structure of the viceroy's civil administration and the organization of Egypt's military presence that Egyptian systems served as the model for everything in the south, from the reign of Amenhotep III and even earlier. In some cases, inscriptions refer to towns, villages, and forts governed by officials titled Hadia, mayor, following long-established Egyptian customs. The use of the word township indicates that the Egyptian idea of a city and its surrounding lands had taken root in Nubia. Many of these settlements, including newly established towns and rebuilt forts from the Middle Kingdom, were centered around temples. These temples supported the economy and justified the concentration of large labor forces in specific locations. Many of these new towns were also enclosed by walls. The demographic makeup of these southern settlements and the relationship between Egyptians and the native population remain topics of scholarly debate. To what degree did the native Nubians adopt Egyptian culture? And how many of the inhabitants during Egypt's imperial peak were actually Egyptian colonists? Archaeological evidence shows that while the latest group burials dating to the early 18th dynasty remained rich in native style, changes gradually appeared from Hatshepsut's reign onward, indicating a growing adoption of Egyptian customs and burial practices. Some native leaders began using Egyptian names or married into Egyptian families, but their descendants did not continue to hold power. The expansion of the Egyptian empire brought with it an imposed administration that left little room for local control. Nubians had no special status in this system, and local independence was rare. The South was reorganized under what was essentially a plantation economy. Prime agricultural land was seized for the benefit of the crown, temples, or elite officials. Egyptian colonists were introduced as civil servants and farmers. Prisoners of war from Canaan were used to work the fields and serve as unskilled labor for the temples. Most of the region's agricultural output was shipped to Egypt, with only basic provisions left behind to sustain operations. A decree issued near the end of the 14th century BC gives a detailed look at the types of people living in or passing through Nubia and Kush, as well as those under their control. Their primary responsibilities included gold mining, tax collection, forced population transfers, labor service, and agricultural work. Besides the viceroy and his administrative team, the list is heavily dominated by military roles. Commanders, charioteers, stable managers, officers, fort commandants, and regular soldiers. The civilian roles mentioned include mayors, village leaders, agents, and overseers of Nubians, a title that suggests an isolated, controlled native population. In summary, during the Egyptian Empire's rule, a powerful Egyptian minority comprising military, administrative, and civilian officials exercised complete control over a much larger native population. Some native elites, particularly families of former chiefs, adopted Egyptian customs to varying degrees. But overall, the native Nubians were pushed into a subordinate, servile role, stripped of any real influence in the governance of their own land. Egypt's ambitions in the south to expand its borders exploit resources, and reduce the local population to servitude are perhaps most clearly seen in the religious sphere. In this realm, Egypt thoroughly overpowered native traditions. Whatever forms of worship or local religious practices existed, in the Sudan before the New Kingdom, most did not survive the Egyptian occupation. Falcon cults, which were widespread in Nubia, might have represented local deities, but it's more likely they were versions of Horus the Egyptian king who was often called Lord of Foreign Lands and brought to these regions by the Egyptians. Similar reinterpretations likely applied to other gods, such as Thoth, whose symbols appear linked with Thutmose III and Amenophis I. As Egyptian settlers moved south, they brought their deities with them, particularly those associated with the Nile's cataracts in Upper Egypt. In keeping with Egyptian religious customs, the female goddess also gained prominence in the region under the title Hathor, Mistress of Wat. However, the most important religious institutions during the New Kingdom were the temples dedicated to the pharaohs themselves. As soon as Egypt re-established control in the south, shrines honoring the divine kingship began to appear first in settlements revived from the Middle Kingdom and later in newly established towns. These temples served dual purposes. They provided places of worship for both Egyptian settlers and local inhabitants, and they acted as bold architectural declarations asserting the pharaoh's legitimacy as ruler of Nubia. Most of these temples were built during the 18th dynasty, starting aggressively under Thutmose III and continuing through the reigns of Amenophis II, Amenophis III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun. Even during the 19th dynasty, when Egypt was no longer founding, new colonies in the South Temple construction remained intense. Ramesses II alone built at least 10 temples south of the First Cataract. The specific economic role of these temples in Nubian life remains unclear. Were they self-sufficient estates with landholdings? If so, were these lands in Nubia, Egypt, or both? Did the temples receive their own endowments? The use of the phrase "in the house of Amun-Re" in connection with Nubian temples during the Ramesside period implies that these may have functioned as satellite branches of larger temples in Egypt. However, this theory is complicated by the fact that Nubian temples are almost entirely absent from Egyptian administrative records. Recent approaches to interpreting the expansion of the 18th dynasty and beyond have led to a wave of ideas, some quite clever, that are starting to shape assumptions the original scholars may not have intended. These include applying modern economic and state theory terms to understand ancient empires, suggesting that ancient rulers engaged in long-term strategic planning, understood production costs, and sought efficiency, as reflected in how goods were distributed in outlying regions. Arguing that resources from Africa, such as gold, were used to finance state functions elsewhere in the empire. Each of these ideas deserves careful scrutiny. It has become somewhat fashionable among Egyptologists to treat the ancient Egyptians as rational economic thinkers, what we might call Homo economicus, similar to how we view ourselves today. This trend encourages the use of modern economic theories like rational expectations to analyze ancient behavior. However, imposing such concepts on ancient societies can be misleading, especially since many of these modern ideas are already under debate among today's economists. More importantly, this approach risks ignoring what the ancient Egyptians actually expressed in their own writings. Their records show that ideologies such as asserting power, avenging wrongs, and defending honor mattered far more than economic considerations, particularly during the early phases of empire building. None of the ancient sources show any sign of concern for gaining resources, controlling trade routes, or replacing middlemen. Instead, Egypt's rulers described military campaigns as responses to aggression, efforts to punish enemies, or actions taken to protect the realm. The dominant message in these texts is not economic gain, but the need to ensure the safety and supremacy of Egypt. The typical disorder and instability associated with non-Egyptians were seen as direct threats to Egypt's security. Pharaoh struck first against Kush to eliminate unrest across foreign lands and to prevent invasions from abroad. The Nubians had to be subdued because they were suspected of planning uprisings against Egypt. These acts of resistance were often labeled as rebellion, especially when Egyptian settlers were attacked, their livestock seized, and their lands confiscated. In many early 18th dynasty inscriptions, Egypt is portrayed as a vulnerable figure, like a mother who expects loyalty from her children, yet needs a heroic male protector. Kamose set out to rescue Egypt, whom the Asiatics had ruined, while Thutmose III is hailed as the savior of Egypt, fighting in the breach. Even Thutmose I recognized this role, claiming he empowered those who had been afraid, removed evil from Egypt, and made her a ruler with all other lands as her possessions. One of the clearest expressions of Egyptian imperial ideology is found on a stela of Thutmose III from Buto. It declares, "The southerners are in his grasp, the northerners under his command. All lands and foreign nations tremble before him, lying prostrate beneath his feet. Foreign rulers bow their heads and cry out, 'He is our master!' They serve him out of fear. There's no land he hasn't entered to extend Egypt's power. Myriads mean nothing to him. He's a king who single-handedly slaughters nomads in battle. He compels the chiefs of retinue to deliver their labor taxes, submitting like servants of his palace. He achieves more than an army of millions behind him, a peerless warrior unmatched by any king or general, whether from the south or the north. He deserves praise equal to his strength. Since he took the throne, Egypt fears no other land. She no longer bows to the south or pleads with the north, trusting in her champion like the god Min, his arm raised in victory, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Menkhepper, archer of Montu, who extends his frontier to the edges of the earth, to the highlands of Miu. Kush serves him as a vassal, sending endless tributes of gold, ivory, and ebony. No king, past or present, has matched his deeds. This statement captures the essence of Egypt's imperial outlook: divine approval of the king, overwhelming military dominance, global intimidation, the feminized image of Egypt as in need of protection, and the king's noble role as her defender. There is no room here for the modern logic of economic planning or cost efficiency. In simple terms, Egypt expanded its borders as a means of defense, and the conquered peoples, like Egypt's own peasant class, were reduced to tenant farmers whose land, labor, and produce were subject to pharaohs. It is difficult to reconcile the idea of long-term planning and deliberate policy with the actual evidence from the pharaohs themselves. At nearly every stage, we encounter a certain impulsive or improvisational character, poorly suited for long-term strategic goals and more inclined toward on-the-spot decision-making. Kamose might declare his intentions or desires. Amenalphis II might give a brief account of his attitude toward the Nubians, or Akhenaten might share his opinions about Canaan, but none of this amounts to what we would consider a coherent government policy in the modern sense. The suggestion that the spread of Egyptian or Egyptian-style artifacts in the outer regions reflects a deliberate policy from the central government is hard to support. This view overlooks the clear lack of concern among Egyptian officials regarding where goods ultimately ended up. It also tends to ignore any serious analysis of how towns and settlements were classified and spatially organized. In trying to evaluate how an imperial center influenced its peripheral settlements, one must consider the hierarchy that the center imposed. In any empire, the central authority has the power to promote, support, or neglect certain towns, and that directly affects what kinds of objects or remains might be found there. It's important to remember that Egypt referred to all the settlements under its rule simply as towns of pharaoh, denying them any independent metropolitan status. Only two general categories of settlements were used: to towns and hamlets. And there was an unspoken ranking system for these settlements, ranging from administrative headquarters and garrison towns to name-based towns, supply depots, and rest stops like water stations. It would be worth exploring how the distribution of Egyptian or Egyptian-influenced artifacts corresponds to these different settlement categories. During the New Kingdom, the means and likely the exclusive right to export Egyptian goods and artifacts on a large scale belonged to a small group of powerful figures, the king himself, the vizier, the chief treasurer, and the heads of a few major temples. These state-run caravans and expeditions weren't primarily about trade in the modern sense. Their goal was usually to extract or demand specific items from smaller foreign communities, more a form of targeted acquisition or gift exchange at a high political level. Because of this, true private enterprise or entrepreneurial trade was largely absent from the Egyptian imperial system. For those in power with virtually unlimited authority, cost was of little concern. Expeditions to the Sudan, for instance, could involve hundreds of donkeys traveling the long and difficult desert routes rather than the more efficient river path regardless of the expense. Tens of thousands of people might be uprooted and exiled to distant regions at an enormous cost that no frugal government would tolerate. Armies of 10,000 men might be dispatched to extract a few blocks of stone that a few hundred workers could have handled more efficiently. Once again, as with the building of the pyramids, the pharaonic state engaged in grand, extravagant gestures not to maximize utility, but to showcase the boundless power of the god-king. It was about cultivating an image of divine might and heroism, not efficiency or restraint, both in appearance and in intent. Some have attempted to describe Egypt's conquest of Nubia's mineral resources as part of a financial strategy designed to fund Egypt's global ambitions. While the model may offer some insights, describing it as a form of finance is misleading. The term originates from monetary economy systems where money facilitates transactions and helps secure goods or services from various sources. But Egypt's centralized, monopolistic system functioned entirely differently. There is no clear evidence that the influx of mineral wealth from Nubia directly supported Egypt's political or military influence abroad. It is not necessary to assume that southern gold was what enabled Egypt to expand or maintain its empire. As far back as the Old Kingdom, Egypt exerted influence into the Aegean without relying on Nubian gold. And during the New Kingdom, Nubia was subdued long before its gold mines reached full productivity. The Asiatic Empire, too, was not built on wealth extracted from the south. Egyptian campaigns in Asia were often carried out by modest forces composed of conscripts and laborers drawn from temple estates. These troops, far from being highly equipped or well-financed, often relied on food and supplies produced locally in Egypt. Their rations were grown along the Nile and transported to the front lines. In this way, the expeditionary forces of the New Kingdom operated much like those of the Old Kingdom, mainly launching raids and slave-taking expeditions. Long before Nubia's economic value was significant, for at least the first century and a half of Egyptian control over Canaan, the cost of occupation was borne by the local populations. Only during the Egypto-Hittite conflicts in the 13th century did this model begin to shift. Most of the precious metals acquired from Nubia flowed into pharaoh's treasury or temple treasuries. Although the temples grew enormously wealthy, their holdings were still firmly controlled by the state and remained part of the broader pharaonic system. The main goal of the Egyptian state throughout its history was accumulation, not circulation or redistribution. While a limited amount of gold and silver may have been used in trade, both domestically and internationally, the vast majority of it was simply held as reserve rather than actively spent, one real but often overlooked use of Egypt's increased wealth in precious metals was its application within a system of loyalty and reward, known as FQ3. This should not be confused with formal state salaries or official compensation. This loyalty-based reward system primarily operated within the Egyptian population rather than in dealings with foreign groups. Certainly, the pharaoh might offer small tokens or gifts to foreigners who were present on His Majesty's waters. But such gestures had been part of Egyptian practice since the Old Kingdom, long before significant quantities of gold from Nubia became available. While Nubian gold may have appeared to be a new incentive to present to foreign rulers, it was far from essential to Egypt's foreign relations. In truth, such rewards represented only a small portion of Egypt's total resources and had little impact on the broader framework of state policy.